Good morning, everyone. My name's Toby Bellwood. I'm the product lead at Amazy.io, and welcome to this webinar on how governments can leverage open source and the cloud. It's really exciting to be able to talk about these things. These things are all passions, particularly of mine, but of our collective selves. Prior to joining Amazy, I was the tech lead for the GovCMS project over in Australia, and have spent a number of years working in open all sorts of things in government. So it's really exciting to talk about this for me. Before I introduce the panelists, we'll go through a couple of housekeeping things. This is a Zoom webinar. We've got the panelists are obviously doing the talking. We do have a Q&A box available through Zoom. If you click on the little Q&A button down the bottom, you can ask questions. And we'll take questions that way, and we'll try and answer them live in the panel. So we'll do a couple of sessions where I'll check and make sure that there's see if there's anything that people desperately want answering. Failing that, I've got questions that we can ask and we can get underway with. We will be recording this session and we will be making it available afterwards, so you can sort of share it more widely if you think you asked a particularly poignant question or we had an especially relevant answer for you. So with that, I'll get to introductions. Joining us today, Michael Schmid, the CTO of Amazy.io, who are the managed open source hosting provider of GovCMS. Bruno Lago, who's a managing director of Catalyst Cloud, New Zealand's open source infrastructure provider. And Dave Sparks, the owner of Sparks Interactive, the full service digital agency provider for New Zealand government initiatives. Do you three want to do a quick blurb about yourselves over and above that?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Michael, or people in the open source community call me or know me as Schnitzel. Yeah, I'm originally from Switzerland. Now I live in the US, and yeah, started the company Amazy.io and the open source tool Lagoon that we're going to talk about today.
Okay, cool. And oh yeah, go ahead, Dave.
No, you go for it, Bruno.
Look, the only thing that I want to say in addition to that is that I've been on this cloud computing journey with Catalyst for about 5-6 years now. And I was there right at the beginning when the idea of building a New Zealand public cloud provider using open source software, open hardware, data centers that have open APIs, was just an idea. Started there as a solutions architect, went through the whole implementation process, the fast growth phase of the company, and nowadays I'm the managing director of the company. But throughout this discussion, I'm quite happy to answer both business related and technical questions if you guys have any.
I'm Dave Sparks. I guess I've been building commercial websites for about 25 years. Last 15 or so years, that's been a substantial amount of work for the public sector here in New Zealand. As a business, our approach has always been, client needs, business needs, audience needs first, and then technology serves those. But with cloud adoption gathering pace, it's interesting for us to flip that perspective around and consider how the new technology and approaches creates opportunities for meeting new needs and for meeting the same old needs in new and better ways to make things better for those clients and audiences.
All right, thank you all. Might as well get it away. My first question, it's about open source. So it's companies that have built models and services around open source software and hardware infrastructure and APIs. What do you consider to be the main strengths of the open source model, and what are your personal evaluation criteria you use when selecting open source tools?
Should I give a crack at that first? Look, one of the things that always amazed me about open source software is how people can achieve something much greater through the power of working as a community, right? If you look at things like developing the Linux operating system, that's a massive task. You don't do that as an individual, you don't do that as a single company. So some of the projects that Catalyst is working on, like OpenStack, for example, has over 350 companies worldwide and more than 20,000 developers contributing source code to it, right? That's the sort of investment and diversity that I find really hard for a single company to achieve on its own. I guess the next point for us would be the undifferentiated heavy lifting. Like if you look at technologies like Linux or OpenStack, that's not what differentiates you as a service provider in the market. So why not collaborating around something that you have as a common problem that everyone needs to solve, and focus on the things that makes your company unique to your customers? And finally, the last one would be, especially as a cloud provider, really important to us. It's something called provenance. It's the ability to inspect and modify that source code, right? Especially when people are handing over their systems and data to you, it's really important that you have confidence on what that source code, what that application is doing behind the scenes. And that's something that you cannot do with proprietary software that you just got from commercial off the shelf from a vendor. So yeah, here are 3 points that are really important for us as a cloud computing company.
Yeah, I think I can echo what Bruno said. For us, this is very similar. The other thing that we see specifically a lot of times now, we are actually the first time that either governments or enterprises, that the projects that we do with the customers are the first time that they use open source. And specifically for governments, I think what is really cool is that every dollar invested into an open source tool not only means it will bring a dollar to the country itself, especially if the people work in this own country or if it's developed in the country, but it can then also be used by any other companies or any governments a second time. And that's what we see, for example, in Australia now, where we run GovCMS, which is on a federal level, but now the same tools can also be used on a state level or on a smaller level even. And so that's basically what, yeah, every dollar that is invested can be used multiple times. And I think that's something with proprietary software and with licenses. Yes, there is investment into the countries and software, but everybody else that wants to use it pays again the same license and the second time and the third time. And so I think it is much better, specifically for government money invested, that this almost, I believe, it has to be open source. Like there should be no other way than it being open source.
And Michael, I would go one step further and say it's not even within the country with states and the federal government, but across countries, right? Like the amazing investment that the Australian government has put into the Lagoon platform, now potentially benefiting New Zealand and other countries.
Yeah, I mean, when we came to open source, there was one question we asked, and that's, does it work? When we engage with a client or do any project work deploying a website, that's the deal, right? It's got to work. Has it worked well for people who are in a similar context to us, a similar situation? The scale of the work we're doing these days, you have to look at what's the effort required to deploy and maintain, who else is on that journey with you, who else can you collaborate with? It's dangerous to go alone. Why would you go and try and invent your own wheel when you're drawing on 15, 20, 10, 5 years of experience from other people? Open source isn't just about copying someone else's work. It's about seeing what they've done and adding to it what you can do. I think it suits us here in New Zealand very well. I think it's a great culture that works with our work culture. It's less of a revolution for us than it is for some other more kind of hierarchical corporate cultures. Rather than just going around in circles reinventing solutions every 2 years, you build upwards in a spiral. You get better every go round. Every iteration is an improvement. And so, sites that we work on now, they may take 4 weeks, 4 months, or 6 months or a year to deploy, but within that period of time is drawing on 5, 10, or 15 years of experience and lessons learned, hard-won lessons that other people have had to suffer through. And I don't want to suffer through those same mistakes again. So I build on what's there,
I think, drawing on Joe's point about the culture of it, obviously open source is built on collaborative cross-discipline teams. What can government agencies do to prepare for sort of their cloud and open source journeys in terms of organizational structures, cultures, etc.?
Well, I think that it's recognizing that there is collaboration and sharing inherently built in to how open source works. If you go into an open source environment, you're working with other teams, you're working with people that may be in the marketplace at the same time as you and traditionally would be considered competitors. But you're all working on solving the same problems together. Within the agency teams, they need to be able to have permission to work within a collaborative, open sharing environment. If your teams are still organized around vertical stacks of responsibility, that's your job, that's your responsibility, that's your fault if something goes wrong, then that's going to stifle the level of communication and collaboration that's required. I think for us, we were a traditional web agency 10, 15 years ago, coming into the open source space, and I would stand at the front of the boat cracking the whip, and everyone would row in time, and it would be, that's how the machine would work. And you go, well, why are you guys stopping to talk to each other? You should be working. But that talking, that collaboration, that sharing, that's where the value happens. That's where you discover things that you can't discover just by having your head down and bagging away. So teams need to have permission to collaborate. They need to have permission to talk, build relationships, and build trust. Because when things go down, if there's a security incident or you come up against a gnarly problem and you're under pressure, it's that sharing and that collaboration that's going to get you through. And if you haven't practiced that, it's very difficult when you're under a pressure environment to suddenly open up and start talking about, what you're doing and why. You need to just get past that, a defensiveness about situations or what's gone wrong. It's not about individual responsibility, it's about a collective group effort. And that sounds kind of airy-fairy, but in the heat of the moment, that's what's going to get you through.
Yeah, I think I can.
Toby, I think it's
confirm
important to acknowledge. Oh, go for it.
Go ahead, Bruno. Mike, dude.
I was just going to say that we also need to acknowledge that there is a lot that has changed over the last 5-10 years here in New Zealand, right? Once upon a time, if you said, hey, I'm going to develop a web application or a website and I'm going to use open source tools, I'm going to use Linux, I'm going to use Apache, I'm going to use jQuery, maybe there were a few laughs in the room. Today, if you're developing a new web application and you're not talking about things like Angular, React, and open source web development frameworks, there's a question mark. You're raising some eyebrows for why you're not using these excellent tools that are nowadays considered best practice or the state of the art in web development, right? So there is a massive shift in terms of the developers. There's also a change in terms of preferences from the government, maybe inspired by what happened in other countries. Like if you look at the UK, for example, the digital initiatives in UK have a strong preference or mandate to develop and use open source first, and only not do it if that's not possible. In New Zealand, we see initiatives where open source is being preferred now. And this is really nice, right? I think we are learning that there is a better model and we are changing in that direction.
Yeah, one thing I want to say about the culture stuff, I think this is super important what Dave said. And I think that's actually a lot of times the piece that is ignored, where people just think, oh, now we're going to use open source and done. I think we also have to understand that especially the companies that are very, very active in the open source term, they don't fit this regular old school, I would call it, culture. Like that's this sharing, there's going to be two worlds that clash on each other. So that means that if somebody, or if a department or a government agency wants to use open source, I think they also have to understand a bit that they bring a new breed of people in that project that expect to share or expect to communicate very openly and don't follow hierarchies maybe that often. And I think that's something that maybe initially can create some tension and confusion. And I mean, I'm definitely one of them that, like, if I have a problem and I know who to talk to, I'll type them directly in Slack and say, or in a chat system saying, hey, can you help me? And only later I realize, oh, I didn't ask all these people. And that's maybe, especially for government, is maybe sometimes really hard. But like Dave said, this is where the secret lies. This is where problems get solved much faster. Like one thing I can, an example is, like, we did all the hosting for all the COVID websites in Australia. And so at one point, the information from the web agency or the developers of the website, they knew 10 minutes before they published something. And so if this would have gone through the regular processes of that opens that ticket, that person assigns it to them, that person assigns it to them, and them, just the assigning would have taken longer than 10 minutes. But us jumping into like a Zoom call where everybody was together, or in a chat system where people could talk directly, that helped a lot. And because we knew these people already from up front, this was not the first time we talked to them in that specific war room or situation, but because we knew these people already, it was much easier to react and ultimately handle these situations. But I think it is definitely something that the leadership on both sides, on the agents, on the customer side, and on the provider side, need to understand that there are different cultures that will clash at the beginning a bit, and that there are ways to like help both sides, and also understand that there will be some time until this is figured out. But I can totally say yes, this should be encouraged, and it's gonna make the work for everybody a lot easier.
Yeah, I think if I just kind of chip in again, open source and the open source approach is not just for developers. I don't come from a development background. I come from a project management client service background. But the open source values are ask for help first. Don't just say, I'm going to solve this problem by myself. Ask for help, share results, and compare outcomes. It's about putting yourself out there and saying, this is what we did. I don't know how good it is, you tell me. And then you let your open source community test your results and test your security outcomes. And they're not just showing up to throw rocks at you. They're not just there to criticize. They are there to look for improvements and look for how things can be better. The first question should be, who's done this before and how did they go? When we started up this business, I was like, we are never going to write our own CMS. I've seen so many companies go down that road before. And I still see clients today, it's 2020, I still see clients today being pulled from the wreckage of a proprietary CMS. And you go, why are you in this situation now? It's terrible for you. But open source can help. You've just got to put yourself out there, and it can be a little bit of an uncomfortable feeling, but it's not really going to hurt. It just only helps.
I'll take a quick question from the floor, which was, what approaches do you have to ensure everyone in your company is engaging fully with open source at a community level? It's obviously challenging for new developers, people who aren't used to working openly, and those that have sort of a level of unfamiliarity with the specific community processes.
I think one thing we tried at Amazy in general is to, first of all, really encourage it from a leadership level, like making sure that this is accepted or that this is encouraged. And then as a second step is like giving people a new tool to learn, maybe give them some trainings. Many open source communities have really easy step-by-step like first tasks, first issues to work on that are really easy. There is a lot of times there is like some kind of online system where people can ask even the dumbest question, like, what is Git? How do I use that? And so like in the Drupal community, for example, there are these office hours where people can just saying, hey, I want to help and I have no idea. So encourage people to go to these. Or the other system is like having a buddy system, where if you have a more senior person in your team that already has done it, that already fallen 3 times on the process of being a contributor, give them somebody that they can ask, that they feel safe. At the end, it's all about creating these safe spaces and specifically making sure the first experience is good. Because if the first experience is rather weird, then I fully understand that anybody says, look, I tried, it wasn't fun, I'm not trying again. But if the first experience is really good, people will try to do it again. So I think the other thing that could be done there is also like celebrate successes. So celebrate if somebody contributes something and something gets merged in to a project, celebrate this as a team. I mean, there's so many ways of celebrating. It can be a Slack message from the boss to, I don't know, a shout out during an all staff meeting or things like that. But really, like, I think acknowledging that this is scary. Like, it was scary for me the first time being in a Drupal event and doing something, but just accepting this and helping people along the way. And I think that's what worked really well for us. The last thing I want to say is also, there is always people that they will, even though they get the best support, they just feel not being able to do this. And I think that's also totally fine. Like forcing somebody too much to be open, to be an outgoing person is not gonna work. So there is also a time that maybe at one point you say, okay, we tried, but that's also cool, and not forcing it on top of people.
I have something interesting to share, right? I think on the at Catalyst, we do have the benefit that the company has such a strong alignment with open source as a way of doing things, that we do tend to attract people that are into that mindset or already understand that I can build something greater if I build it with other people, or they had that aha moment in their lives where they say, if I tap into collective intelligence, I can solve problems faster, I can solve problems better, right? But not everyone that joins the company is familiar with open source. So there are some support structures at Catalyst other than being surrounded by people that do it all the time. We have things like the Open Source Academy, for example, that takes students that have never done any open source contributions and take them through the journey of doing their very first open source contribution. We have training in open source tools that are common, like Git, for example. But also one of the things that I would suggest is leadership should encourage and prompt that community engagement, right? So for example, I had a few times with the engineers that work with me on the Catalyst Cloud, people that were working in isolation and trying to solve something really hard, and they spent a day or two trying to crack that out. And my question to them was, did you talk to the group of people that created this? Have you reached out on Slack or IRC or whatever mechanism and asked, you know, I'm going through this, how does it work, right? And it's incredible to see what happens once you motivate them to go and ask that question and how fast they move, right? So sometimes you have to push a little bit in the sense of, you know, give it a shot. But once you get familiar with the process, you will do it naturally, right? You'll probably think there's no other way of doing something like this.
Yeah, I think that you know, open source brings great technology to the table, but it's a people thing. That's where the power comes, leveraging you know, social interaction and groups and teamwork. And I think that if you've got a team within your agency or you know, across agency and vendor, if you've got a team that trusts each other and communicates well under pressure, you know, anything can be sorted, right? You can do anything. But that kind of you know, trust and communication under pressure only comes with practice. You know, it only happens when people have spent time working together under pressure and time developing that understanding. And like, I wasn't born the most patient person on the planet. And it took me a long time to get my head around the fact that other people could help, and time is the magic ingredient for anything that involves people. So, you know, it's very difficult to manufacture time within a project timeline or while you're under pressure from a security event, but you can do the prep work. You can prepare for those types of events. you can give your team time working together before they engage with the hard stuff, and you can forgive them time, and you can be patient, and you can step back and say, okay, this is going to take longer than I would like to resolve, or longer than I would like to get to the next step. But if I spend the time now, it'll save me 10 times the amount down the track.
I'd like to dig back on a point something that Michael raised a bit earlier. And there's one thing a lot of us have learned over the last few months is that this website traffic can scale suddenly. If it's been COVID related, certainly any announcements to do with anything in that space has seen traffic just skyrocket. And there's a number of case studies, the GovCMS case study, there's the state of New York did one, there's a couple from elsewhere. And this happens so suddenly without warning. How do you help your customers build and prepare for this sort of scale, and how do you prepare for unpredictability from an infrastructure, application, edge perspective?
Well, I think I'll jump in and start with the very base layer of the infrastructure, the data centers, the compute servers that they use to host that application, right? One of the fundamental characteristics of cloud computing is elasticity and being able to drive the automation, being able to drive that via APIs, right? And by elasticity, what we mean is allowing customers to request more or less resources without having to notify you in advance, right? Now, those concepts are not new. Let's be honest. We've been doing this for years now. If you think about electricity, you don't call your your electricity supplier and say, hey, I'm about to plug my fridge or my television here, and can I please have more power, right? So effectively, what cloud computing is doing is to expose these APIs or interfaces, right? Imagine it as a power plug. And when you use these interfaces, you can say, I need to draw more compute power. I need to draw more block storage or networking. So fundamentally, cloud computing infrastructure is built to allow customers to do that, right? That's not to say that there aren't a set of best practices on helping customers to scale an application fast to respond to an event like this. You can do it at the very base infrastructure layer with load balancers and auto-scaling groups, but you also have platforms like the Lagoon platform from Amaze and Kubernetes, who are built from the ground up to benefit from cloud computing, right? These are second generation technologies that know how to make use of cloud computing really well to scale. And that's probably the part where I should handle to Michael, so you can talk about how the Lagoon platform in collaboration with Kubernetes interacts with that ability from the cloud provider.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the right word is there, the second generation cloud. If we look at the first generation, that was really about and that's how we hosted also a couple of years ago, is that you have virtual machines and you scale additional virtual machines up. But especially in COVID related things or any other announcement, scaling or starting a VM still takes a couple of minutes. Maybe you can get it down to 30 seconds, 1 or 2 minutes, but it's an actual operating system that boots up. It's all the services that need to start. It needs to register itself. So if you want to scale instantly, VMs are not enough anymore. And that's why we switched a couple of years ago. We switched everything to containers at the end, Kubernetes, because containers can scale. The marketing says almost instantly. If you measure it today, it's maybe 1 or 2 seconds. You can add additional containers to the system. So how we run our clusters is that the clusters at the end still run on these VMs, but the resources of these VMs can be dynamically allocated. So for example, if there's a site that suddenly needs a lot of resources, Kubernetes knows that there are maybe less important sites like development environments or other stuff that can be removed. So what Kubernetes does, it in real time allocates the traffic to the correct containers. And then when Kubernetes realizes that there's not enough resources, let's say your 100 CPUs that you deployed, you're at 80% of these 100 CPUs, it will then talk to the APIs of Catalyst Cloud and saying, hey, I need more VMs. And then these VMs come up. Again, they take a couple of minutes, but then you have 120, 150, or 1,000 CPUs, how many you want. And so it's really this additional platform level that allows to scale almost instantly. And what we saw, especially in COVID cases, is that without these systems, we could not have survived these things, because a government sending out 20 million text messages at the same time, yeah, you can long try to start additional VMs. That's not going to be it. And I think the other piece is also all of this needs to be automated. Like it's you're lying to yourself if you say, oh, I can just go in there and scale it by myself. Like that's we're long past that, because who knows that suddenly a message comes out 2 a.m. in the morning where maybe somebody's not online, or the government decides on a weekend to push something and your people are not working about that time. And so I think that's really important from the platform. But, and I think we can pass to Dave, it's actually the application is hugely important as well, because if the application is not good enough, the infrastructure cannot fix that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many layers to what's going on today. Like in the olden days, you know, in the last century, you'd have, you know, a piece of code sitting on a box somewhere, and that box was continuously publishing. But now there's so many components in the stack. There's more than one tool in the toolbox for resolving problems. You need to make sure that your stack is aligned, that everything's working together, and there's no bottlenecks in that chain. But if you've prepared and you've got your tools at the ready, then in our experience, one of the defining you know, characteristics of speed of response or scaling is that decision-making turnaround time. So, you know, do you have permission? Do you have cost approved to scale, to burst services, to throw people at a problem? Can you get in touch with the person who is the decision maker? Is there delegated authority? And in terms of what government agencies can prepare to, you know, do to prepare for scaling, either in response to a success event like getting the COVID information out into the hands of everyone, or for a security event where you're being DDoSed or whatever. You need to be ready to make decisions, have a process for taking in information and making a decision and getting that decision communicated out across your team as quickly as possible. And that's not necessarily as easy to solve as a technology problem.
Yeah, that's correct. One thing that I also want to mention is that I think, and we did this specifically with GovCMS, but we do that with pretty much every customer that has any possibility to scaling, is really tested through. Like, without a system that has not been tested, and go high, like bring the system to the point that it breaks. Like we tested, I think like we tested some of the sites for like 50 times more traffic, and we knew it works. And we felt like, yeah, 50 times is enough. Until then, the mentioned text messages happened, and it was 100 times more. So we were lucky, but we didn't test it that low because we said, no, that's impossible. So now what we do is we go as high as we can, like that we know, okay, at which point is the system breaking? And also not only don't test it in the environment where everything is going across according to plan. There is a new term in engineering in general, it's called chaos engineering, which means that you have a system that starts to all the time, like in containers, for example, delete your containers, or in Drupal terms, for example, think about what happens if in the highest traffic, an editor goes in and clears cache in your Drupal site. Like this is because I can tell you of every system, it never went smoothly. Somebody realized on the height of the traffic, oh, there's a typo on the start page. Let me shortly go and fix it. Yeah, of course, because that's where your site breaks. So yeah, test is really through, like give people, I don't know, tell somebody like just go in and go change stuff on your website, and during that time send 100,000 people, 500,000 people on your website and really test it out. There's tools out there that can really easily simulate this traffic, and luckily, because we all paid on demand, it's not going to cost you a lot to test this for a couple of hours, because as long as you shut down all the servers at Catalyst again, it's not they're not going to charge you. So it's not going to be a very expensive, but at least you know what your system is capable of doing, or you find maybe issues that you never thought. But it's much better to find them now than on Sunday morning, 3 a.m., trying to figure out how to fix your site while it's already down.
I think the point Brendan makes in the chat's really valid as well. It's not just infrastructure. Infrastructure scaling isn't going to help you if your site is a heavy site anyway. So optimizing your site for this kind of traffic from the day it's designed is sensible. The peak of the GovCMS, we were seeing cache offloading at 95, 98%. And if that's taking 1.5, 2 million hits an hour or page views an hour off you, then that's making our lives significantly easier. And that's where when Michael says sort of prepare, test, knowing that sites are capable of that kind of caching makes it that much easier to prepare for. If you're doing that and the site is calling back to origin at sort of 40% offload, there's a lot of application work needed to bring the site to a point where it can run like that.
And I think that's where, Toby, the combined knowledge of the entire application stack and the business is important, right? The question is, what architectures or what options are suitable for the site? Because there are some sites we cannot cache, right? If you have a sports event and what you're doing is to tell people the results live of whatever is going on, well, caching is not going to help you fulfill your mission, right? But some sites you can heavily cache and avoid infrastructure costs that you shouldn't incur because the content is not changing very often. And it's really that collaboration of all these layers that we are describing, including intimate knowledge of the business that enables sites or new web applications to be successful like this.
I think the other side to this is probably what about load and traffic events that aren't genuine? Obviously, there's an ever-increasing prevalence of DDoS and other targeted attacks on sites. We've seen it in New Zealand. We've seen it elsewhere in the world. I don't want you to delve into the nuts and bolts of how you respond to these because that's not prudent. But how's your approach to concerns around these kind of events changed in the last few months?
Yeah, I think from a platform level for us, it's actually some of the scalability helps you also survive DDoS attacks. And we maybe have to differentiate between DDoS, which are generally like UDP amplification or things like that, which are just like crazy amounts of traffic that are not actually real HTTP requests, or more like people that just like send a lot of requests out on your forums and web forums and stuff. And I see the term sometimes used intertwined. So for like bots that just try to submit a lot of forms, there things like scaling capability can help you to initially catch all them and then start to block them either on some kind of system level. So in our case, this is like a CDN where we can block specific IP addresses or specific user agents or specific paths or specific behavior. So that's one of the ways that we work with the customers. Again, this has to do with application knowledge. This needs short communication paths. So for some of the really big websites, we have really close communication that we talk to the customer saying, hey, it looks like something weird. Do we want to block this? And they tell us yes, and then we can see this. But that's not really a DDoS. A DDoS is really something where, yeah, there's like million or terabytes of packages sent to you, and that's, at least from a platform point of view, is really the only way that you can solve it on an edge level. And because there are only a few companies in the world that can really handle this. And how this technically works is you want to block these requests as close to the edge as possible, basically already in the country where the traffic comes from. So if you try to block this on your own infrastructure, this is probably not going to work because it's just too much. So we work, for example, with Fastly, which have their own global network, but there are others, Cloudflare, Akamai, Amazon, Google, Azure. They all have these global possibilities for handling DDoS attacks. And I think there it's really, you need to stand on the shoulders of giants. Like that's not something that you just build yourself. Or if somebody claims they have CDN capabilities and they're not one of the really big ones, I would really highly doubt that. So make sure that they can show you that they have these capabilities with either, I don't know, like past attacks they handled, or do a test. You can actually do DDoS. You can go now on the internet, you can buy DDoS attacks and maybe try one and really test this out, because that's
Don't tell
really a
people where to buy them
massive.
from.
Just go to Dublin now. And so that's really like, I think these are massive scales that you really need a company that has proven in the past that they can do this. But and I think that's again like, there is a lot of different levels, and there's a lot of different, again, communication that also needs to happen. Just having one single piece, let's say you have a CDN, if the attacker figures out how to bypass the CDN, which is technically possible in some cases, then it's gone again. So you need to work with all the different vendors and figure out how this all goes. I'm not sure, Bruno, if you want to talk a bit what it is from your side.
Yes, no, I think you are spot on. What you're describing there is really what's considered best practice, right? What we need to remember is that DDoS is called DDoS because it's a distributed attack. So you're dealing with thousands or millions of people or compromised devices that are generating either just random traffic, like a volumetric attack that is just flooding your pipes with more water than they can handle, or sometimes genuine application traffic. And that's where things get really hard, right? It's a complex problem. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are some things that your infrastructure providers or your cloud providers need to do in order to protect themselves or help mitigate this risk. But there are also things that need to be done at an application layer, right? It's not there is no silver bullet against DDoS attacks. And they are happening more frequently, and it is important to think about them a little bit ahead of time. So in our case, we've been working very closely with our customers, talking about what else they can put in place as additional lines of defense, often at the application level. And the best practice is really to engage with providers that have international infrastructure capable of scraping and dropping that traffic as close as possible to its origin. So if the traffic is coming from my country, from the place I was born in Brazil, for example, you don't want to wait for that traffic to come to New Zealand and start overloading resources here in New Zealand, because you don't even know whose resources you're overloading. It could be, telcos or people that are part of the public internet infrastructure in New Zealand. It could be your cloud provider in the end or the application itself. Ideally, that traffic never reaches our shores. Right? And there are specialized solutions for that. And it's not only your infrastructure provider, and it's not only bigger is better. Really, you need to think about how to protect it from the application point of view. And it's really how to protect yourself. It's about smarter, not necessarily bigger, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not an infrastructure expert. We build websites for people. But I look at what's going on out in the infrastructure world, and it's about having options or tools at your disposal at each layer in the stack. It's it's like watching my kids play a game of balloon defense, right? The attacks come in. You might get them at point of origin. You might get them en route. You might get them at your place. But I think that cloud is a more secure option by default, right? It lets you kind of move your site or traffic away, move your point of vulnerability away from the point of attack. You can avoid the attack. You can duck and dive. It's much more effective than kind of layering up and digging in and like, I'm going to die on this hill for this website. Cloud infrastructure lets you move around and be more agile. But I think I would like to make the point that DDoS has been in the news, it's been in the media. There's media coverage about these big events and big catastrophes happening. But I think the conversation around security needs to be much more routine. You know, we have to talk to clients about it all the time, not just high profile targets or high value targets. Sometimes we look at the stuff that's going on websites, like small, tiny little websites with you know, a few tens of thousands of people coming through every month. And you look at what's going on and you go, why would someone bother doing that? Why has someone in the world decided to kind of launch an attack? You know, 99% of the time it's just nuisance value, it's an annoyance. But then, you know, that 1%, it's a showstopper. I think that the having a secure mindset, being aware of those concerns needs to be always on. It needs to be across the organization. Because, you know, both you know, Michael and Bruno made the point that sometimes it's the application that's causing the vulnerability. Sometimes it's that 10 meg video file that someone from marketing has uploaded onto the homepage that is making that page particularly vulnerable to even a low-level kind of attack. People need to be aware and share that responsibility across the team as well. You know, it's not just the big stuff that causes problems. You know, you mentioned forum signups or web form responses, just getting spam in the door, you know, all the time. And it costs nothing for people to hassle you. You know, there's just random bots out there just wandering around causing trouble. It's just been, you know, it's like the weather in Auckland, right? You know it's going to rain on any given day. You know, chance of rain is high, right? So you just make sure you've got an umbrella stash somewhere and a nice jacket you can wear anywhere. Be prepared.
One thing I want to add there is also, like, I think, and that's actually not talked about so much about DDoS attacks, but a lot of times these are extortion systems, like where people try to make money from your fear of getting attacked. And so, like, the recent ones we had, or that we were involved with on our infrastructure levels, there was only one single attack over 2 hours, but we're receiving every day, we're receiving now emails saying you need to pay this amount of Bitcoin into that address or we're going to attack you again. And so, and one of the things that is really important is that we're talking here about criminal investigations. So be aware that, or have processes in place that if such an email comes in from, let's say, an attacker, that they tell you, hey, we will attack you if you don't do X, or we just attacked you, this was us. Make sure that you have the trail where this email came from. Make sure that you also have the capabilities to hand over exactly what you did to the authorities, because you should involve them. Every country has a cybercrime division, and you should involve them. But they will want to know exactly what happened, what have you done, and also make sure that you don't communicate too much about this publicly, because a lot of times the attackers, they're not really sure if they actually sent the email to the right person. And so be aware that this is actually, and this will maybe end up being a case for some kind of authorities. And so collect everything that you can. Don't involve too many people. Involve only the right people, because it could also be somebody from inside of the company that has some knowledge. So yeah, be aware of all of this. And I don't think that's too much talked about. We talk a lot about the actual infrastructure stuff, but a lot of times there is behind an extortion in some case or form.
I think for a final question, how do you help agencies and customers evaluate these risks, these and other risks around the sort of choice of hosting options, particularly around the use of third-party tools? We've talked about sort of edge computing, we've talked about a couple of other technologies there. And for New Zealand, as in Australia, data sovereignty. How do we approach these conversations with agencies and customers?
I'll jump in on that one. You know, I talk to customers all the time. That's kind of my job, is dealing with them and helping them make good decisions. And it's the new environment, the way things are today. You know, we can come in as an expert and tell people what we think, but we can't tell them what to think, you know. Unless our client agencies develop that capacity to understand and evaluate risk profiles around their data or their activity, making good decisions over the long term becomes a burden for everyone. It's not just an event, right? It's not like we come in, throw some consultancy on the table, solve problems, walk away, celebrate into the sunset. Security risk is always on. You need to be always aware of what's happening. You know, Michael mentioned, you know, maybe it's an inside job. It's much more likely that it's an inside mistake and that someone has clicked an email they shouldn't. You know, agencies need to develop a security mindset, you know, do some training, go check out SafeStack Academy or something. Security is about behaviors and decisions by people over the long term. And I don't think you can outsource that. You can outsource infrastructure, you can bring in infrastructure experts, you can align your tool set, but you can't outsource data security. You know, for government agencies, that is core business. You need to own that, and you need to be prepared to invest in having some sort of expert ownership over that, I think.
I'll just comment on something that happens here in New Zealand often, right? Whenever an agency is bringing a new website live, they are required to perform a security and privacy assessment of that application. And this assessment will indicate whether the property has personally identifiable information or classified information, anything that requires more strict controls in place. Because let's be honest, not everything needs that level of security or controls. And what I mean by that is that you have information that is public knowledge. And it's okay if you're hosting this information anywhere, possibly. I'm not saying that's what we should prefer, but I'm saying it's acceptable. However, there are web properties or web applications that hold data that is sensitive. And in that case, some agencies may need to introduce additional controls, right? And what these controls are will vary according to the nature of the application and the data. But for example, we do have a lot of customers that have to host data onshore with a New Zealand-owned company, right? And the reason for that, one thing that we need to remember is this whole thing about cloud computing, about being able to host applications anywhere in the world is quite new. And legislation hasn't caught up yet with the state of technology, right? So there are no global laws that rule how data privacy works. You have specific laws from different countries saying how it works. So New Zealand has its New Zealand Privacy Act. But for example, one thing that many people don't realize is that if you place your data in a different country, then their laws on how the data should be handled apply. And it's a bit even more complicated than that. If you have your data, for example, hosted by a company that is headquartered in the United States, for example, and it doesn't matter that you're hosting in Sydney, let's say in Australia, but the company actually has headquarters in the United States. That means that that company is subject to a piece of law called the USA Cloud Act, right? And the Cloud Act can be used to force US headquarter companies to hand over data to the American government against their wishes, no matter where the data is held. This is something that global cloud providers are pushing quite hard back, right? Because no one thinks this is acceptable. But it's important to acknowledge that it's happening. So, for example, if you go to the law enforcement request report provided by Microsoft, where they share the statistics of how often this happened, right? In 2019, there were 30 Cloud Act requests for data of 50 different New Zealand-based users or accounts, right? So we cannot just neglect and say it's not happening. It happens. And I think we need a little bit of time for legislation to mature and for global laws to be developed that handle this more carefully. And until then, our job is to do an assessment of what are the needs of this specific application or web property, how sensitive is that data, and what controls, how careful should I be when handling it, right? It's also probably fair to say that we are, at least in New Zealand, not being as strict as we should with some of those things.
All right, keeping an eye on the time, I'll start the wrap up. Thank you so much to Michael, to Bruno, to Dave for all of your insights. Thank you to everybody for asking questions and for coming along and listening to us talk. We will be making this recording available. So if you really enjoyed the sound of our voices and want to listen to more, I recommend trying to fall asleep to the sound of my voice. My children say it's a beautiful voice for falling asleep to. Do so. I'll let Michael, Bruno, and Dave do a little bit about how best to get in touch with them and their respective businesses.
Yeah, on my side, it's go to amazee.io. There is a contact form. There's email addresses on there, on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. Send me an owl if it reaches me to the US. But we also have people in New Zealand, so you can also send them there. Yeah, whatever you will find, I think it will reach us.
Yeah, thanks for having us along, Toby. It was great to chat with Michael and Bruno. You know, it's nice to just kind of hang out and talk for a while. If you need to get in touch with or want to get in touch with us and have a chat, I'm always up for a coffee. Haven't got down to Wellington as often as I'd like this year for reasons. But yeah, always up for a chat, always happy to kind of talk through the landscape and give some reckons. So yeah, you can just find us at Sparks Interactive. Pretty easy to find on the internet. So flick us an email or you know, hit me up on Twitter or whatever.
Yep. Look, in my case, feel free to reach out over LinkedIn by searching by my name, or go to catalystcloud.nz, and there is a contact form there. And the message is directed to me, come to my mailbox.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much. Again, much appreciated, and I look forward to catching up with you all in the future. Maybe we can do one of these things in person in maybe 3 or 4 years' time.
Nice one. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you. Have a good day.